This is the Balanced Leader Podcast, the podcast that helps leaders elevate their wellbeing and create healthier workplaces. My name is Rob Hills, and I'm your leadership and wellbeing coach. In today's episode, we dive deep into the journey from burnout to brilliance with leadership expert Trudy MacDonald. Trudy shares fascinating insights about why 38% of Australian workers are experiencing burnout. Drawing from her own experience of burnout as a CEO and her own extensive work with organisations, Trudy reveals practical strategies for building psychological safety, resetting team dynamics, and creating sustainable high performance. Whether you're a leader worried about your team's well-being or feeling the strain yourself, this episode offers valuable insights for creating a more balanced and brilliant workplace. So let's dive into today's conversation with Trudy MacDonald. Welcome, Trudy, to the Balanced Leader Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, Rob.
I am really excited to have you on the show today, particularly as we're diving into going from burnout to brilliance. But before we dive into that topic, can you just tell the listeners a little bit about your background and how you came to become an award-winning speaker, a coach, and a leadership facilitator?
I sure can, and it's such a pleasure to be here. I think like many people in life, when you talk about their careers, you sort of just stumble into the work that you do rather than it being a deliberate goal or ambition from the outset. But I have a background in organisational psychology, and I think that really piqued my interest around organisational performance and culture, and that very quickly took me into the space of startup organisations, doing a lot of work with leaders, leadership development, and really starting to lift the bonnet on what made people tick and subsequently how can we maximise performance. I think the other thing that was happening in parallel throughout that stage of my life and continues to is I'm an active athlete. So I've been a ballet dancer for many, many years. Now I'm a competitive rower.
Oh, wow.
And I think that the concept of high performance is something that's always resonated with me. So that's become a real passion and a real interest. I've had wonderful opportunities to lead many organisations, both internationally and in Australia, and to work not only with some of the world's largest organisations from a consulting perspective, but also to work with startups and very small businesses. And one thing that I continue to remind myself of is people are people at the end of the day. It doesn't matter what size organisation or even what industry they're in. At the end of the day, we want the same things. We're driven by the same things. And what I'm really passionate about is being able to have a real impact, not only on individuals and how they feel about themselves and their performance, but also the teams that they work in and ultimately the organisations that they're part of.
Yeah, that's great. How then did you become interested in the topic of burnout? Is this something that occurred in your life, or is it something that you see with the organisations and the people that you work with?
It's a bit of a combination. So certainly in the last few years, the topic of burnout has really hit the headlines on a global basis. And it's really been since COVID that this has started to get some real media attention, but also attention of leaders around the world. But I think in understanding that so many people have been experiencing burnout, it made me reflect on earlier in my career. And you're absolutely right, I have experienced burnout. It was probably about 15 years ago. And to give you some personal context, it was my first CEO role. I live in regional Australia and I was commuting 6 hours a day.
Oh, wow.
To and from my workplace. Now, if anybody ever gave me a job description today and said, you're going to commute 6 hours a day, I'd say, you've got to be kidding.
Yeah.
But at that stage in my life, it was an opportunity. It was the right thing to do. And for family reasons, I was living in regional New South Wales. But because of that, the distance, I was getting up at 3:30, 4 o'clock every morning, commuting to work. I had a 6-month-old child at that point in time. I was still breastfeeding and subsequently carrying around a little freezer bag.
Yeah.
I mean, the things I did were absolutely insane. And, you know, I look back on that period now and I recognize, and I'm being very vulnerable here, but my priorities at that stage of my life were number one, work. And I feel really quite ashamed to say that at this stage of my life upon reflection, but work came first. My children came second. My husband came third, much to his despair. I came forth
Yeah.
and I was suffering, and my friends and family didn't even get a look in. And I look back on that period now and I think, you know what, I could have done a whole lot differently if I knew what I knew now.
Yeah, thank you, Trudy, and thank you for being vulnerable and talking about your experience. I find when you're authentic like this, it really helps people look at their own situation and maybe even ask themselves some of the hard questions. So I really appreciate your honesty in that answer. Was it something that triggered your thinking to think something's got to change, this is not working? Or was it something that just happened over a period of time that was quite gradual? Did it sort of sneak up on you, if you like?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I see, and in a moment, I'll talk you through how we got to where we are as a society now, where a huge percentage of people in Australia are experiencing burnout. But if I go back to my personal situation, it definitely crept up on me.
Yeah.
As mentioned, my priority was work. It was my first opportunity in a true leadership role, which had been an ambition for me, and I'd worked very hard to get there. And I think, you just get on the treadmill and you start to normalize a lifestyle that actually isn't healthy. If I look back now, my cortisol levels, my stress levels were through the roof, and I was just in survival mode. And what actually triggered it for me was I started to experience the physical symptoms of burnout. I pride myself on being a very fit and very healthy person, and I started to get really sick. And I was going to the doctors and they were shaking their heads, a bit perplexed, going, I'm not sure what's going on here. But I think what's really interesting upon reflection as well is they never asked me about stress and they never asked me about lifestyle. They were doing a whole lot of medical tests to find out, what was wrong with me, and they found nothing.
Yeah. So do you think that was a reflection on the period of time you're in? Do you think nowadays, if you went to a doctor, they might be a little bit more aware about the stress because it is such a big thing in society?
Yeah, I would hope so. But let me jump into where society is today, because I think this is what really piqued my interest around burnout.
Yeah.
Burnout has not been a focus for me. My focus professionally is building high-performance organisations. However, I've recognised in the last few years, one of the barriers to that happening is actually the individual and what they're experiencing. And the latest statistics for Australia are indicating that about 38% of the workforce is self-reporting work-related burnout. And it's probably useful just to have a quick definition of that. There's three key elements. There's the physical symptoms of burnout, which are generally related to exhaustion, getting sick, not sleeping well. You've got the cognitive symptoms of burnout, and they're related to the inability to think beyond the moment. I'm in the day-to-day, I'm in the moment. I don't have the headspace, and that's an expression a lot of people will use. I just don't have the headspace or the mind space to think strategically, to have that difficult conversation, to hold somebody accountable in my team, because I just can't deal with that right now. And then you've got the social symptoms, and the social symptoms are actually often related to withdrawal. I don't feel like socializing. I don't feel like hanging out with my friends or my family. And I'm not taking the time to connect with people on a meaningful level. So if 38% of the population is currently experiencing those symptoms, it actually becomes a real challenge for leaders. And in fact, leaders are not exempt from this. I do a lot of executive coaching of CEOs and senior leaders. And in the past few years, for the first time in my career, I've seen more leaders than ever before saying, you know what, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. The mental load and what I've been asked to do is well beyond what I've got capacity for.
So why do you think we're seeing this unprecedented levels of burnout? And particularly among leaders? And again, another great reflection that leaders are sort of stepping back and going, I can't, I'm done. It's really an interesting period that the numbers are growing and people's awareness around it is so high as well.
Yeah. And if I just add to that, I think, because I got really curious about it, right? So what I've seen across Australia post-COVID is so many organisations have been very generous with their wellbeing initiatives and really looking after their people. I've never seen a list of benefits so long in my life, everything from massages to yoga classes to educating people around wellbeing and burnout and how we can manage that. The really interesting sub-statistic of that 38% is that approximately half of that group are working remotely. And I think there's something in there. That's what started to really get my interest. So to answer your question, how did we get here? I think it's worth recognising that COVID changed something in our mindsets. And specifically what it changed was how we feel about work. For many of us, we were just on that work treadmill, as I was 15 years ago. And, I knew it wasn't right that I wasn't spending time with family or even for myself. But I just had the mindset that this is what you've got to do. This is what you do professionally to get ahead. Our mindsets changed post-COVID because I think we started to recognise that we're vulnerable as a species, that there's more to life than just work. So we've been through some really interesting phases, and the media has been fantastic at putting big buzzwords around this. So your listeners will recognise terms such as the Great Resignation. That was not long after COVID, when everybody was changing jobs and leaving the corporate world in many cases, going and moving to regional areas or moving into a part-time executive role, which previously would have been unheard of. We then moved into the not so great resignation where people started to stabilise a bit, but then very quickly the term quiet quitting hit the headlines. And I think that was the first indication that people are change fatigued. And this is what I was hearing from a lot of leaders, because there had been so much change happening in people's personal lives and in the workplace, particularly with this shift between working remote versus hybrid versus having to learn new ways of working and new ways of connecting. People were exhausted, and that started to create some awareness around this, along with mental health issues. But then we've now gone into a phase that's referred to as the Great Exhaustion. So this is where now globally it started to be recognised that people are actually exhausted. And right now, and I think this is fascinating, that the current terms, and it's fascinating to watch the media because I have a little chuckle, but there's truth behind it. The Great Stay, so people are now more motivated to stay. However, this is the other term that sits alongside it, resenteeism.
Oh, I haven't heard that one before.
It's a classic. It's a classic, resenteeism. And what it refers to is employees, even though they want to stay for job security and financial reasons, many people are starting to resent their employer. Now, what are they resenting? They're resenting a few things. Number one is, you're trying to get me back into the office in some cases, and I've proven to you that I can work from home. So there's a bit of that tension happening in a lot of organisations. I think that the bigger one is that people are working hard. Now, are they productive? That's a different question. But people are working hard. And I think part of the issue with hybrid and remote work is, for a lot of people, they don't have the separation. So the laptop sits on the kitchen bench, and with all of the wonderful technology we've got right now, people are not switching off. So people are perceiving that they're working harder and subsequently feel as though they should be paid more money. However, you've got organisations saying, well, actually, our productivity is only 2/3 of what it was a few years ago. Our profits are down. We can't actually afford to be paying you more money, nor is the performance there. So there's a lot of tension in organisations, and with that, you get poor behaviours, you get interpersonal tension and conflict, and culturally, we're starting to see across organisations there's some real challenges starting to emerge there as well.
I'm fascinated by this term, resenteeism. I've tried to write it down and I'm pretty sure I've spelt it wrong.
It's a mouthful.
And what you said about it, it really made me think, yeah, okay, I can definitely see that happening. So is this because it's a mindset shift, and is this maybe even a generational thing? And I'm not sort of saying it's all about, the latest generation and their attitude towards work. But is the attitude towards work shifting, which is creating a mindset shift, which is creating this resenteeism?
Yeah, look, I got so curious about this as well. There's a few things. One, and there's another term. I need to share another classic with you, which is hushed hybrid.
Ooh, hushed hybrid.
Now, yeah, right. So what this one means is a lot of organisations have policies in place around hybrid work arrangements. So 2 days from home, 3 days in the office, for example. A lot of leaders are actually not complying with those policies. So it's hushed. It's like, shh, don't tell anyone, but we're going to work from home an extra day, me included. And that's creating tension and conflict because you've got some leaders that are abiding by the policies and then they're looking across the corridor going, hang on, that team's not following the rules. And that's creating a bit of resenteeism and challenge as well.
Yeah, right.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, Rob, what was the question that you asked me?
So basically, because of the experience we're having with resenteeism, is this because of the attitude towards work? Is that changing, and is that because of our mindset?
Yes, yeah. So I think what's happened is this. So post-COVID, we got invited into everybody's lounge rooms. And what happened is we had to create a much higher level of empathy and understanding for our teams, for our staff. So as leaders, what we started to get schooled on very quickly is that we had to adopt a much more humanistic approach to leadership. So no longer was an authoritarian approach, not that that was ever a good approach to leadership, but a lot of leaders got away with it. Yeah. So we had shortages in the talent market. People were walking if they weren't feeling engaged and connected and consulted with. So leaders started to hear very quickly, you need to be much more empathetic. You need to be much more humanistic in your approach. And many leaders did that with good intentions. We've lent in, we've supported, we're checking in with people, we're asking, are you okay? And this is all really, really great. However, with that, in my opinion, we've created a sense of entitlement. And I hear this from a lot of leaders where now people feel entitled that they can just work from home whenever they want to, or my dog's sick, so yeah, I'll be working from home today. And I'm going to tell you I will be working from home today because that's an entitlement. So I think part of that shift, it's not generational. I think it's across all generations, is what we've created habits over the past few years through this incredible period of change. And these habits have now created a new expectation. And I think one of the things that goes alongside this, which fascinates me, is even though we've become more empathetic, a high-performance organisation is also an accountable organisation. And I think the scales have tipped too far in the favour of empathy, and a lot of leaders have lost their ability to have effective accountability conversations. Now, how's that connected to burnout? If you're working in a team where people are not being held accountable, then the work comes back to individuals. We create inefficiencies. We don't have role clarity. What another part of the business is doing is not setting my part of the business up to be successful. And what happens is we get busy, and that's what I'm hearing from so many people. It's a classic Aussie greeting. How are you? Oh, I'm really busy right now. It used to be a badge of honour. Now it just means I'm burning out, this is inefficient, and it's not working. And I think that's actually one of the key root causes behind why we've landed in this space.
It's interesting you talk about entitlement. We're going out of an employee market, I think, over the last couple of years, certainly maybe even just before COVID and all through it. To now, I think we're shifting towards an employer market.
Yes.
How do you think this is going to impact the piece around burnout and resenteeism and hush hybrid and all of those different things that are happening?
Yeah, you're right. There's some big shifts happening. So the latest data I've seen is that as we come into 2025, there will be more people looking to move roles. And the key driver is actually going to be pay. It's going to be salary. So we've got another macro factor sitting around all of this, which complicates it further, which is that the cost of living continues to be very, very high. And I think if you've got an environment where people feel as though they're working hard and they're sensing or they're perceiving they can earn more money elsewhere, even if their company can't afford to pay them more, they're going to be out there looking, which is quite interesting.
And that's going to put a lot of pressure on the market. And I think, I live in Canberra. It's a public service town. There's a lot that the government can't do, particularly for public service workers, around shifting salary. So
that's right.
I think that's going to create a spiraling upward effect potentially of salaries if people are constantly looking. But as you say, a lot of employers can't even pay those salaries because they're getting a little bit unrealistic.
That's right. So in the work that I'm doing with leaders, I really focus on what leaders can do and what they can control. There's a whole lot that we can't control. And you're right, with the shift in the market, it's becoming more of an employer-driven market. This is a really important time, I think, for leaders to reset their cultures and to reset expectations. So if you can imagine that the support and the empathy that organisations are providing for employees is at an all-time high. It actually can't go much higher, in my view. It's an opportunity to recalibrate that with empathy, with accountability rather. Now, I think what's interesting here is for a lot of organisations, they're scared of accountability because they think accountability is punishment. However, there's been some real shifts in the market here, and if we can first of all change our mindset, I think it can start to create some really positive downstream impacts on individual burnout and levels of resilience, but also the performance of the organisation. Because at the end of the day, we need a win-win scenario. There's no point having a lot of people who are feeling high senses of well-being, but they're still not productive at the end of the day, because that's going to create a different tension point. So the first mindset shift is to recognise that accountability done well is not punishment. It's actually one of the most motivating things you can do for people. Because if you look at the research around what creates an environment of well-being, there's two key things that people need. They need to feel a sense of achievement and accomplishment, and that comes with accountability, right? We feel good that the dopamine triggers, it kicks off in our minds when we have a sense of achievement, and we feel great around that. And the second thing that we need to create a sense of well-being is meaningful connection. And meaningful connection can come through accountability. You can create meaningful conversations that are high support with your leader or your manager, and that can make you feel great. But where the shift in the market has really started to come to life is making accountability a team sport. So now you start to talk about those meaningful, high support, high trust connections with your colleagues. And that, if we can get that right, I think that's going to be one of the biggest shifts to shifting the national issue we've got around burnout that we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. In your talks, you talk about going from burnout to brilliance. So in your mind, what does a brilliant team look like? Is it a team that has obviously good accountability, good connection?
Yes.
Are there other factors at play here as well?
Yeah, there are. So there's a number of different foundations that we need to build upon. And I think at the most foundational level, you've got the concept of trust, and also referred to as psychological safety. And a brilliant team has a high level of trust of each other, and they have a psychologically safe environment. Now, this is well researched, and I think the most recognised research around this was actually from Google. So Google globally, a number of years ago, did a 5-year longitudinal study. And they were trying to find the X factor amongst Google teams globally. What is it that differentiates brilliant teams at Google from average teams? So they weren't even looking at the poor teams. They were just comparing brilliant teams to average teams. And they looked at this from a whole range of different perspectives. They had psychologists, they had business experts, they had engineers. And what came out of it was there was a significant difference in one factor, and it was psychological safety. So Google's brilliant teams globally had a high level of psychological safety, and that was the X factor. There were other things such as dependability, a real sense of purpose around what they're doing, knowing that they're having an impact, and clarity of responsibilities. So I think those things make sense. But this was quite new, this concept of psychological safety. And what it means practically is, in a team environment, individuals feel safe taking interpersonal risks without any fear of consequences. Now, what that means practically is that I can show up to work and be my authentic self. I'm not having to posture and behave in a certain way just to fit in. So I need to feel comfortable in my own skin. That's level one. But level two is what's called learner safety. And that means it's safe to step outside of my comfort zone, go into that learning zone where I'm not always going to get it right. In fact, often I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm not going to feel blamed or punished. In fact, my mistakes are going to be celebrated as innovation, as learning, as progress, and the team's going to lean in and we're all going to build on that, which is going to lead to us being so much better in the future. Level 3 is referred to as contributor safety. And what that means is, can I have a voice? Can I dive into somebody else's swim lane and contribute an idea without being told just to get back in your lane? This is not your area.
Yep.
Back you go. So do we have those open debates and conversations where we're sharing ideas without repercussions? We're not getting offended. We're not getting defensive.
Yep.
And then not surprisingly, level 5 is challenger safety. And what that means is, can I give feedback? Can I challenge? Can I challenge the boss's thinking or decision, knowing that the boss is going to say, you know what, thanks for taking the risk to bring that to this forum. Let's talk about it. It's really important that you've shared that. Let's as a team explore this. Is that the kind of environment you've got? Now, if you can create that in a team environment, you've got a really strong foundation for accountability, for ownership and commitment, and ultimately for getting results, which is how most leaders will measure the impact of a team. But the end game is a lag indicator. What we can work on are all of those things that actually get us there.
Yeah. And I imagine there is a few people listening to this going, yeah, okay, we're probably at level 5. There's probably more people going, we're at level 4.
Yeah.
There's probably a lot of people going, we're at level 3, and so on.
Yeah.
How do people move up the levels? If they recognize that perhaps my team doesn't have that psychological safety yet,
Yes.
what are some steps they can take towards progressing up the ladder?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it isn't easy, but there's one really important thing that will shift the dial straight away. And it's the leader of that team holding up the mirror to themselves and asking, how do I need to behave? And I love this concept. A lot of leaders have to-do lists, encouraging leaders to create a to-be list. Who do I want to be? What is my leadership brand? And there's a few really important things that leaders can be that will really help build psychological safety. And the first is to be vulnerable. And vulnerability it does take courage, but the best leaders are vulnerable. And it's about admitting your mistakes. It's about not being the smartest person in the room. It's about going to your team and saying, you know what, I'm not sure how we're going to navigate this problem, but I reckon we can work it out as a team. So let's talk about it. Yeah. So vulnerability, really, really powerful. The second really practical thing that teams can do, and there's a whole lot of great tools out there. I'll name one of them, DISC. It's well known. Tools that help identify different work styles and different communication styles, and actually getting to know each other and recognizing that not everybody prioritizes what I prioritize. Not everybody is motivated by what I am motivated by, and we think differently. But together, we've all got strengths. They're different, but if we bring them together, they can complement each other. So opening up the conversation around understanding our similarities, understanding our differences, and how we can work together, that builds trust. And it's incredibly powerful because then you've got the foundation for creating dialogue. And it's actually the dialogue that enables us to move into that psychologically safe zone. Often what happens is we engage in what's called the fool's choice. And the fool's choice is I either be really honest with you, or I lose you as a friend, or I lose our relationship. And we think it's one or the other.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to be honest with you, well, that's going to be the end of the relationship.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to say nothing just to maintain the peace. And I see this so often in organizations, but then what happens is the lag time between these critical conversations that should be happening gets longer and longer and longer. Sometimes it goes on for years, and we've got this underlying tension and mistrust. That is not a high-performing team, and it's certainly not a brilliant team.
No, absolutely. And getting in early, even though it's hard, is often the best medicine.
Yes.
And I've seen this throughout my career where leaders put it off, and it just snowballs and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And what could have been a quite simple, easy conversation becomes such a hard one.
Yes.
And so much anxiety and angst around having the conversation, not to mention the loss in productivity and the team dynamics going out the window because there's so much focus around this. It's such a good point to do that.
That's right. Yeah. So let's bring this back to burnout for a moment. If you've got a culture or an environment where people don't feel safe to speak up and there's that underlying tension, I get called into organizations often because there's tension and there's silos and there's conflict. what happens is people are experiencing burnout because the cortisol levels, the stress hormone, is through the roof. And suddenly we don't have those honest, trusted relationships where we can ask for help, or we can say, you know what, I'm struggling with this. Can we just bounce some ideas off each other? Those conversations don't happen.
Yeah.
So there's no wonder people are experiencing burnout. And I think this, the space that we've moved into around hybrid and remote work, I think it's wonderful. However, it creates the opportunity to lead differently, because unless we can deliberately create opportunities for connection, for celebration, for accountability, it can lead to some really toxic behaviours, and that's what's fueling burnout, in my view.
I imagine you've seen a lot of this over the years with different people and different teams that you've worked with. Are you able to share a story where a team or an individual has gone from burnout and recovered back to brilliance?
Yeah.
Is there one that comes to mind?
Yeah, there are, and there's many. This is the space that I operate in. So there's an organisation that I'm working with. I won't name them, obviously, but they recognised that productivity was going down. They were starting to lose people, so people were resigning, and internally there was a whole lot of noise around how different parts of the business weren't appropriately supporting other parts of the business. So you've got an organisation that's now operating in silos, there's toxic behaviours, people are leaving as a result. They also had a situation where people were working a lot of overtime. So you're always going to get different levels of performance. You've got a normal distribution. You've got to get those who just, dig in and work harder and harder, and those who throw up their hands and go, you know what, if I'm not feeling good about this place, I'm going to give you minimum effort. And that's the quiet quitting concept that came out. So with that organisation, we actually did an engagement survey. So they saw all of these issues, leadership saw it, but the first thing we said is, look, we need to hear from your teams what's actually going on here. And that was really powerful because we got some really pointed insights around what, from their perspective, is actually driving disengagement. And leadership's sense was right. People were highly disengaged on average. I think what's interesting about engagement surveys is it gives you really powerful insights as to what people want. However, I use the analogy, it's a little bit like asking young kids, what do you want for dinner? I'll have McDonald's, I'll have KFC, right? So what people want isn't necessarily always good for them, right? So if I use that analogy, so even though we'd done the engagement survey, I think what was useful is that gave people a voice. And it created the trigger to say, okay, we need to do things differently here. But then in the work that I was doing with the leadership team, I was coaching them on the things that we knew would actually work and make a difference. So it was a bit of a top-down and a bottom-up approach. But one of the things that we did is we got the leadership team together, and we started at the top of the organisation. And I think this is a really important point. If you're going to look at some kind of intervention, you need to get the leadership team working as a high-performance team, because if that's broken, you're not going to have any success as you go down.
Yeah.
And what we did is we got them together at an off-site with a few key objectives. Now, let me just take a track back, because I think the messaging around this is really powerful for your listeners to hear as an idea. The message sounded a bit like this. Team, we've achieved some wonderful things over the last 12 months. This is what they are. And we should be really proud of these, and we should be celebrating what we've achieved. As we move into the coming year, we've got some equally ambitious goals, and all of you are going to play a really critical role in our success and us coming together to deliver on our purpose as an organisation. However, we recognise that the way that we've worked and the way that we've achieved these goals over the last 12 months is not sustainable. We cannot continue with these ways of work, because we're acknowledging that in some cases we're working in silos. In some cases, some of you are individually burning out. And in some cases, the culture of the organisation is not making this the best possible place to work. So we're going to engage in a reset, because we want to make sure that as we go into the next year, this is a great place to work for you, and you've got appropriate balance, and what we're doing and our ways of working are sustainable. So that was the messaging. And I think that was so incredibly powerful. And then what we did is we got the team together in a full day offsite, and I facilitated this. And there were a number of key objectives. Objective one was, let's talk about our ways of working, and specifically what's worked really well in the last 12 months. And let's share those ideas and let's double down on them and let's embed them across the whole organisation. So that was a really powerful discussion around collaboration and sharing and implementing what we thought was best practice for that organisation. The second part of the conversation, and this is where you really get to the heart of it, is what's really sucked, what hasn't worked, right?
Yep.
And let's create a safe space to put that on the table. And together we're going to work through these things and work out how we can do them differently. And I think what was so powerful coming out of that, there were a few key themes. Role clarity was one of them. What had happened is over the years, managers and leaders particularly were just rolling up their sleeves and getting in and helping the troops, but that had created new habits. So there was an opportunity to go, you know what are the most important things we need to focus on? And let's give ourselves permission to stop doing things that are not adding value. And that was such a powerful conversation. The second thing that came out was accountability. So how do we reset our accountability cadences and practices? And let's normalize accountability, but let's do it in a way that's high support and engaging and motivating for people. The third theme was decision-making. And recognizing that so many transactional decisions had bubbled up to leaders, whereas we needed to actually reset this concept of delegation and ownership, and how do we allow those transactional day-to-day conversations to sit with the right people so they feel empowered and have that sense of autonomy. And that was going to free up the leaders straight away. And then the fourth one was meetings. So many organisations just kill time with meetings that are purposeless or go for too long or have too many people in them. So there was an action coming out of it to basically wipe our calendars of all internal meetings and start again and deliberately design from the ground up what do these meetings need to look like. So that there's an example for you of a methodology, and I've got a particular organisation in mind, but we've rolled this out so many times. And from there, is the change instant? No, it's not. However, what happens is you come out of that offsite with a roadmap and an action plan that the participants have bought into. And then what you start to get is you get incremental shift and change. And I think that the thing that's so important for people is hope. If they can see that there's a plan and there's a big shiny light at the end of it, then that's going to shift people's mindsets, and it's also going to lift productivity and accountability.
Is hope almost a medicine for someone who is getting close to burnout or starting to feel it? Is it, again, that mindset shift where they go, oh, you know what though? I can see that on the horizon that maybe this is going to shift, maybe this is going to change.
Absolutely. And in the world of psychology, it's referred to as locus of control. So you've either got an internal locus of control, and what that means is I can actually control this. Things aren't great now, but I can see they're going to be great in the future, and I know what needs to be done, and I know what I need to do to get there. That's highly associated with well-being and resilience and performance. People who have an external locus of control, that's where they sit back and they say, I can't control this. It's happening to me. My life is happening to me. I've got no control. And that's where you get much higher instances of burnout.
So for leaders who are listening to this thinking that, you know what, 2024 has been another tough year, and I like the idea of some sort of mini reset before we hit 2025, what would your advice be to them? Would it be to sort of set aside some time and maybe, you know, have a mini discussion around what's gone well, what sucked, in your words? What could we do better for 2025? Is that a good place to start? Is it around just having a conversation?
It is. And what I'd recommend to add to that is link it to your strategy. So people need to know what success looks like in 2025, and getting your leadership team as a minimum involved in the creation of strategy or reminding them what the strategy is so incredibly powerful. And I think, as mentioned earlier, if people feel a sense of achievement and accomplishment, their well-being goes up. So let's reflect on the year that's been. That's a great conversation now. Let's talk about the learnings from that. Let's paint a clear picture of what success looks like for next year. And for many leaders, they'll be thinking, gee, there's not that many weeks until the end of the year.
Yeah.
I've got no time to do a reset. But I think even just talking about what's been, what's coming, and then setting the expectation and even locking in the date to say, when we come back next year, we're going to sit together. We're going to take the time to have a proper conversation. This is a full day. For some leaders, they might even take 2 days, and let's have some dinner and can reconnect with each other. And we're really going to revisit our ways of working. And that's going to happen, mid-January, end of January.
Yep. And I'm wondering if there's a way that a leader listening to this who suspects someone in their team might be sort of suffering a little bit from burnout, if there's a way that they can spot that.
Yes.
Or if there's some sort of telltale signs, some early warning indicators, if you like, that they could look out for.
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is one of the most important roles that leaders play, is to look after the well-being of their people. And that should be the number one priority before anything else comes with work.
Yep.
Now, that being said, as a leader, you're not the psychologist and you don't need to solve the problem, but you need, to your point, Rob, to be able to identify the warning signs. And in some cases, I think to create some awareness in the individual that they may be feeling that way, because particularly for high performers, for highly driven people, they may not actually see it. They're just on that treadmill and it's become normalized for them. So I think sharing what's been observed, and it goes back to those symptoms I mentioned at the start of this conversation, the physical, the social, and the cognitive symptoms, opening up a safe dialogue to ask the individual how they're feeling, to create space for them to talk about other stresses or pressures in their life. And I think from there, starting to first of all, demonstrate your commitment to ensuring that they're in the right state of mind so that they can be the best version of themselves at work, asking if they're getting support elsewhere. And then from a work perspective, starting to unpack where they're spending their time. And there's usually two triggers in the workplace. One will be lack of role clarity, people trying to do too much, and there's an easy solution to that. Just looking, even asking the person to write down everything they're focusing on for a week or 2 weeks, you will very quickly see that there's inefficiencies, there's rework, there's waste, there's things that they should be delegating that they're not. There's things that could be automated. So there's so many opportunities to simplify and focus people's roles. And I think a really powerful conversation around giving them permission to look for those opportunities and then create a plan to start to simplify and focus. That's one area. The second area that will often trigger burnout is the stress, the cortisol levels. And often that comes from either lack of meaningful connected relationships with others. So individuals might be feeling very isolated and they don't have that support network within the organisation, or there's toxic behaviours. And they've constantly got this high cortisol level because they're dealing with the stresses from a poor relationship. And this may be something that's been going on for years in some cases. So I think to your earlier point, don't ignore it. You actually need to lean into that, seek professional help if need be. But how do we move the individuals past that?
Yeah. And I think, as you said before, leaders have a really important role in this. So my next question is then, how do leaders protect themselves? If they're working in a team that is experiencing high demand, high pressures, there are people who are moving towards burnout. How do they care for others while also taking the time to care for themselves?
Yeah, and I think this is the really tricky point, and this is why so many leaders are experiencing burnout, because the expectation to care for others is exhausting. Never mind caring for myself and my family. So that burden of responsibility has got larger. I think a few practical things that are really, really important is, first of all, recognise what fills your cup. And that would be different things for different people. It might be playing with your kids. It might be going for a run. It might be taking some time in nature. It might be doing a yoga class. Whatever it is, find out what works for you and prioritize that time for yourself in a non-negotiable way. And the way I like to think about it is, if you had a medical appointment or if you had a meeting with a CEO or a board or somebody important in your diary, you would say to other people, no, I'm not available at that time. I've got this other really important thing to do. It's having the same mindset around the things that will help you fill your cup. So if that means I'm finishing work at 5 o'clock on the dot on a Tuesday because I'm going to a yoga class, it's been absolutely ruthless that's critical. And unless the sky's falling in, you will say no to anything else. So it's that discipline and that commitment. And I like to think about it as self-respect. I respect myself enough that I will prioritize what I need so that I can actually be my best self to my family, to my friends, to my workplace. It extends well beyond the workplace.
Trudy, I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball here and tell me, in 2 years' time, do you think we're going to get a better handle on burnout as a society in Australia?
Yes.
Or do you think we're where's the trajectory going?
I would hope so. And that hope comes from two things. One is the numbers are starting to go down. They were at 50%, just over 50% in Australia. They're now at 38%. They're still very high, but they are starting to go down. There continues to be so much education and awareness around mental health and more conversations around burnout and getting to the root cause of it, that I feel leaders are really leaning into this. I also feel that leaders won't have a choice other than to get good at managing this, because people will walk. And if we want to retain talent, we need to create healthy workplaces where people can thrive. And that doesn't mean that productivity needs to drop. In fact, if you've got healthy workplaces, productivity will go up. And I think there's a real win-win there.
Yeah, absolutely. Trudy, this has been a fabulous conversation. I might even want to call it a masterclass. I've got pages of notes over here that I've taken, and it's been such a fabulous conversation. But what's one question I didn't ask you today that maybe you had hoped that I would have? And if I did ask it, how would you have responded?
Oh, goodness. So I'll share a question with you that another leader asked me the other day, actually, because I think it got me thinking a little bit. And he said, look, I've got an organisation that I started in my garage. And he said, my mindset as a leader 5 or so years ago when I was in that garage now needs to change. And I recognise that. And what can I do as a leader to 10x this company, to grow it 10 times? And what's the mindset shift? And that really got me thinking. So if I were to put that question on the table, as I've been thinking about this, there's a few things. One is he's already holding up the mirror to himself, but I think for leaders, we need to hold up the mirror to ourselves, and the emotional intelligence that is required to not only control how we show up for others, but how we perceive the world and the stories that we tell ourselves, I think is so incredibly powerful, because we're constantly bombarded by information and facts, and we interpret those facts. And the way that we interpret that information can be a story that's helpful, that will lead us down a productive course of behaviours and actions, or we can interpret stories in a way that's not so helpful. They're hopeless. They just want to humiliate me in front of the team. There's all those thoughts that go through our head. And those negative stories will lead to us reacting and having further negative thoughts. And we get this spiral of negativity, which increases stress levels, which makes just the world not a nice place. So I think that would be a final thought from me. It's the emotional awareness, the emotional intelligence, and telling ourselves helpful stories to open up dialogue and conversations that will ultimately lead us through whatever the future has in store for us.
Yeah. And that perception piece and the storytelling piece is so interesting to me. I know we don't have time today, so we might have to get you back on for another episode in the future. But I think there's another thread that we could pull on and spend a lot of time on. So thank you again, Trudy. If people want to connect more with you and find out more about what you're doing, how can they do that?
Yes, absolutely. So my team and I work with organisations of all sizes in the space of high performance. Our website is www.talentcodehr.com.au. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's Trudy MacDonald, Trudy with a Y and then MAC. And then I'm on Instagram as well. And the tag there is Trudy MacDonald Leadership.